Good evening.
Hello.
How you doing, Darren? Christine?
Yeah, excellent. Welcome to People Purpose Place. We're going to mix it up a little bit this week, and I suppose it's starting to model some of the processes that we like to talk about as a part of our group process. And that is really having different people to do. I'm excited to do that today. So how are you, Christine?
Good, ready to roll.
Ready to roll.
Yeah, it's exciting. Excited to cover back some of the definition stuff this week. I think there's been some really good conversations that we'll be happy to cover off.
Great.
Awesome. So Colby's let me know that today is actually our 20th episode, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, as a part of today's episode, we thought we'd just revisit the definitions of house and home, which is something that's pretty topical, obviously, at the moment. And we've sort of been covering this lofty idea or lofty issue of the housing crisis. And today we're just going to dive a bit deeper into some of those terms and really find out what that means. Process will have. And what I've done today is actually stolen an idea from Trigonometry, which is one of my favorite podcasts out there, a British podcast. And I've just modified one of their questions to get us started, which is, what is an area or concept about housing that is not being talked about?
Yeah, some big topics, and for me, the bleeding obvious one is just healthy homes. How do our houses have potential to enhance our health, or in actual fact, lots of cases they're hindering our health, as one of our hosts is very aware and familiar with it at present. Absolutely. So yeah, healthy homes would be great for us to extend our awareness of and ask more questions about.
Awesome. Christine, do you have some thoughts?
I think one of the problems with housing is the same thing as a problem with talking about anything that has a sociological element.
Yep.
And so one of the things that sort of intrigues me is that we vote for whoever we think is going to do the right stuff for us or for the society, if that's what we're most interested in. Because I tend to be a bit of a class traitor myself and vote for the Greens because I can't stand the rest of the politicians up here. But not to vote for them, like they aren't the people I want to vote for. But what we tend to do is we vote for somebody who's really basically sold us the best. We vote for the best PR person is what often happens. Yep. And then we end up with laws that, end up with unintended consequences. And I would say that one of the unintended consequences of voting Liberal over and over again is that a lot of us own our own homes. So we want the capital of our own homes to become bigger. We want more assets. And of course, then we're negative gearing so we can buy another house. And what this has ended us up with is it's reinforced the individuality of the nuclear family home when the nuclear family is hardly mainstream anymore. There are older people like me and my partner who have all of a dog living in this big house with us, or single people, or indeed there are a whole lot of other arrangements that blended families, whatever, that don't really fit into the mold. And so it's, we've made decisions collectively that have run us a bit into a corner. And one of the things that's happened with all that voting, and we aren't quite sure of what we're voting for because we can't see the future. And often it's quite ideological or it's very PR oriented. So, we vote for our own interests, many of us. As I say, I don't vote for mine, but that ends up with a statistic that I've heard, which is 1 million. I haven't verified this, 1 million empty homes in Australia. And some of them are the people who've been playing Monopoly and they have 10 houses or 20 houses, and 15 of them are empty because they're not getting enough return to keep the houses up. And, we're back to sociology. Renters aren't quite as responsible, all of them, as many used to be, because we've sort of let our standards slip, haven't we? So I'm sort of thinking, what are the causes of the housing crisis or the homelessness crisis that are not being paid attention to? And yeah, we can look at government policy, but who asked the politicians to put that policy in place? And how does society evolve such that really having a nuclear family home, and a whole shitload of them, without, and a lot of people don't fit into that anymore. We're sort of running off the wrong track. So, those 1 million houses, how do you get them back? Airbnb has some owners just don't want to rent. How do we get those 1 million houses back into circulation? And why did they end up empty? Why? And how? And we all have to say, I was part of that. Don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, good point. I think for me, it's
but you see what I'm coming from. That there are a whole bunch of causes of what we've got happening. Some of them are things
we own part of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I heard someone today call that that correlation sort of stuff. They called it coordination failure, and I'll have to do some research on that. But that whole idea that what was the original good idea, what happens when it's actually delivered, as you said, with the fullness of time and all the variables that go into it. What sounded like a good idea, like being able to rent out your house in the backyard to be a Airbnb, has turned into a situation where there's all this stock that's now missing from the market, which can't be used for everyday living. So, I've actually got it down from my notes today after having a conversation with someone else that would certainly be worth investigating. But my point is actually somewhat along the same lines, in that I think the one thing that people aren't talking about with housing, they should be, is the societal impacts of housing. So, and I think that maybe leads a little bit back on to, Rowan's very good with wordplay, and this idea of us having a conversation about a home, not about a house. And for me, that's the one thing we're not discussing. So we're all talking about accommodation. We're not talking about the actual people and the real impacts of people who are trying to live and exist and thrive inside of essentially accommodation, which doesn't give them the ability to even attempt to get on that path. So yeah, good points.
And there are so many more points to make.
Absolutely, and I'm really hoping that we get to dive into as many of them as we can tonight when we jump through. But I was also keen that we've been learning ourselves a little bit to go back to some of the stuff that always worked for us. So I've been conscious of revisiting some of the processes and steps that we've gone through historically, whether it be through the collaborative operating system that we all got trained on or other processes. Sometimes the things that we've left behind actually have some really powerful components to them, particularly in meetings and group formation. So I thought I'd revisit some of those. And one of those was about using a problem statement for today's podcast, and then trying to get an intention for tonight as well. So the problem statement which we mucked around with today is apparently we have a problem which is called a housing crisis, but is it really a problem or is it a homing crisis? So that's the problem statement we're working on tonight. And in the last couple of weeks, I've been continuing to read a book by Diane Musso Hamilton and Gabrielle Wilson and Kimberly Lau, probably got that wrong, called Compassionate Conversations. But they talk about the intention being the ability to cast one's purpose across time and space as if it was a window into the future, so we can see our intention fully manifest. So
That's
lots
nice.
of work. It is really nice.
Nice.
And it's the first time I've fully, got an understanding of the combination of purpose and intent. But our intention tonight is to clarify what we mean by the headline housing crisis and how we can address the real problem. So we've got a list of discussion points, and what I might do is basically introduce one of those topics to start, and then see what we've all got to add as content either side of it. So these will either be elements or statistics of housing that we can open for discussion. So the first one I wrote down here was the size of homes in Australia.
Right.
Does anyone have any thoughts in regards to that?
I have some, I have some memories as working for a manufacturer, a national manufacturer, and I reckon they're probably 10 years out of date, or 10 years ago they were using these numbers.
Yep.
And I think at that point Australia was just matching America for square meterage or square footage in America of size of house per square footage of house per dwelling, and Australia was just eclipsing the States in 2010 or 2011 as the largest
we have
houses.
bigger houses than they have?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah. Australia has the biggest houses in the world, and it was something obscene like 210 or 220 square meters of house.
Yeah,
which is a hell of a lot of area, given that separately today we're looking at the stats of how many people are in those houses in Australia. Does anyone recall the conversation earlier today? 10.8 million homes in Australia, and the average is 2.5 people per house.
and
That's
and
a
I
lot
think,
of space.
oh, absolutely. And I think the stats have actually risen. I had a look in the last month, and I think now the average size of homes in Australia is now 243 square meters, which is substantially larger than anywhere else in the world. And surprisingly enough, the two countries which intrigued me with some of those numbers as well was that there was also a big difference between Canada and New Zealand. They were at about 150 or 140 square meters.
New Zealand was.
Yeah. So, and we surmised when we had that conversation that it might have potentially been related to the climate, So obviously, if you're heating a house, you don't want it to be a big, vast thing. So to some extent, they've factored their houses in to suit the heating costs of keeping that house, hot and cold or warm. So that's intriguing. We've got some great comment coming into our chat as well. So we might actually come back and touch on a few of those things there. There's a comment here that if people would get a job and have more money, then they could afford a higher rent, which due to inflation and homeowners having to pay more than anything else to survive. So there's some really good points there, and some of that might actually be fleshed out as we continue to talk, because we know that some of those issues are absolutely valid, and they're the highlight issues that the media tends to pick up. But there's also some underlying components to that, which is very important. So I think continuing on, which might even answer some of that as well. We talked about the size of homes just before, but also the malalignment of the people and the actual build, which might actually go to what rents look like. So I think you did some research today, Rowan, as well.
Yeah, I was I've just let that example of across Australia, the whole of Australia, the average is 2.5 people per home.
Yeah.
But it's even interesting when you start to dive into, I'm a big fan of inner city living. I love a big metropolitan. That's a lot of baloney. But the numbers don't dramatically increase in our capital cities. In actual fact, Brisbane inner city suburb is a little bit below the national average people per home.
You're kidding.
No. So Brisbane's 2.2.
Wow.
Melbourne is less again. So it's 2 people per home in inner city Melbourne.
In
So
inner
these are
city
our
Melbourne.
high density. Now, some of that in the statistics, the units will be encountered in that as well. So there might be a different mix of product in the inner city locations, but we are just not taking up the use of these spaces in a place where it has all the amenity. We went to the Roma Street Parklands last night, which was a lovely inner city address, beautiful manicured gardens and parks and hot and cold running everything, in amongst skyscrapers and all these 2 million people. And it isn't densified. It isn't lots of people living close together. It is still this very Australian, less than 2 people per household. And I think Sydney is much the same, 2.1, like really small numbers per household in the inner city areas.
And I think that almost feeds into the comment that we've got there. It's an employment crisis. You've got to have the money to rent a house. Now, we're going to push back and create a paradigm there. So if we've just had 2 statistics which says we're building the biggest homes in the world and we've got the least amount of people in them, guess what happens is that means that really big, expensive home is all you've got to rent. So the problem might not be an employment issue with needing more money to afford a higher rent. It might be that our housing stock is completely misaligned with the people who are living in it. And we don't have that conversation. Why is it that we have 2.1 people per house, but we're building 4-bedroom things? Like, how did we get there? Christine, do you have any thoughts about how we got there?
Well, I think I'd like to make one comment, and thank you for that question, because it is a really good question. But the way I see things, and it's not as bad here as it is in some other places like America, but the cost of labor has not kept up with the cost of capital.
Yeah.
So assets have expanded, but productivity has expanded, but wages haven't gone up to match the productivity rises. Yeah. So this is much worse in America than it is here, because we do a lot better job of looking after people than Americans do. Thank heavens.
Yeah.
So I think that, we also have to see this in proportion, that there are things like the number of people living per house, and that even the cost of living squeeze has not forced more people to join together in those large houses with 2.1 people in them.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Right in the middle of town. And it doesn't seem as though at that point, there's some sort of a mismatch between the cost of housing and the reality of what housing is available.
That's a very good comment, because when you think about it, you're right. I mean, ultimately, why aren't we just adjusting? Why isn't it that if we've got all this space in homes, why aren't we adjusting? Some of the stuff we talk about, which is, what would happen if people want to share? Why isn't that naturally occurring? So it's a very good point. The fact that we aren't adapting, are we? We're going to keep doing more of the same things. Like, if it doesn't work, just do it. Work harder so you can pay more money in rent, or you can have a higher mortgage. The irony of it.
Exactly.
Right? I've just pulled up the stats.
Yeah, go on.
Stats for Bondi. So Bondi, I think we all recognise the suburb. Average median price for the suburb, 3.69 million.
What?
3.69.
The average price is almost $4 million. Yes.
And they occupy 2 people per each one of those things.
Oh, imagine the mortgage repayment if you had a mortgage on that.
So, in other words, some people have way too much money and are getting paid way too much.
Yeah,
and
good
some
point.
people just can't keep up because their wages haven't kept up with productivity and their wages haven't kept up with capital.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that, but you're 100% right. It's very interesting that we have this dichotomy in Australia where, yeah, I mean, houses are outstripping our ability to have wage increase, but people continue to go into more and more pain, like the comment we've got. You know, people, I found that interesting when I had a look at some of the reports, is people are not willing to pay the pain with rent, you know, as a percentage of their income, but they are very comfortable with a home ownership to go up to way high levels, above 50% of their total wage, just to have accommodation. That, you know, that can't be a good place to be at. So I think that actually flows well into my next statement, which is the number of, and Rowan's done some interesting research on this one too, but, you know, the number of homes that are vacant in Australia.
Yeah, you just had a glitch in the matrix there. Maybe they don't want us to publish the data. But,
well, there are some secrets we like to keep from each other. And, you know, just think of this secret that came out in COVID. What's an essential worker?
Yeah.
Well, it turned out that all those people that, you know, our guest said, well, get another job. But in fact, the people who have those jobs are being paid too little to be able to afford the houses that are near them.
Yeah.
And I mean, hey, what's an essential job? Why do we call them essential workers and pay them stuff all? And look, I mean, in America, they're still fighting over a $7.50 federal minimum wage. Now, who could live on $7 an hour?
Yeah, no one.
Nobody. In no country can you live decently on $7 an hour. But or maybe in the poorest ones. But isn't it interesting that we haven't, our ideas get out of sync with where we are and the way that society is moving? And I think that's a perfect example. None of us really thought, what's an essential worker before COVID? We sure found out, didn't we? And those people really got dumped on.
Yeah.
Didn't they? They were the ones who had the mandates. They were the ones who had to front up when all the rest of us could hide at home with our masks on.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are so many inequities built into the system, and we just haven't been thoughtful enough about, why would I want to have a 4-bedroom home that only 2 of us live in? That is exactly my situation.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm changing it, but it takes a while to change these things. Yeah.
It does. And some of that is awareness, you know, so ultimately when you see that stat that in Australia, we actually might have over 1 million properties that are vacant, then you could almost say we don't have a housing crisis.
Well, it's absolutely the fact. I mean, ABS is the statistical body, and they have given us the numbers for not, you know, survey night in 2021 when they last did the survey, but it's actually been in place for about the last 30 plus years.
Really? 30 years?
So before the advent of Airbnb, like Airbnb obviously must contribute, but they're not occupied every night of the week.
No.
Night of the year, or on, in fact, census night. But it has been a consistent pattern that 10% of our housing stock has been vacant for the last eight census results.
Really? Rowan, I'm stunned. I thought that, you know, I was coming up with some good ideas by saying, well, this is all sort of caught up with us and we have these secrets from ourselves and we really didn't get thoughtful enough about it. But man, 30 years is a long time to think about something. And if I think quite honestly about my own situation, I mean, when I was younger, I had, you know, various friends living here, or I was off traveling and somebody moved into the house. You know, it was all very fluid.
Yep.
That fluidity, either from age or the way society's working now, is not quite as apparent. And it seems as though there's a lot of sclerosis in the entire housing market. And the concept of 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms for 2 people is, it's a concept we haven't thought enough about.
One thing that has changed over the period of time, over that 30 years, now I won't be exact on these comparisons, but 30 years ago, it might have been 3 times the average wage to purchase a house.
And that's the difference.
Today, it's 10 times. So there's been a disconnect in our average income to cost of housing over that period. That's been stark and dramatic and absolutely clear as crystal to all the economists out there to say these are the facts of what's happening. How do we address that? Nobody's too interested in having that conversation. Because even if you said, okay, for very valid grounds, there's 1 million properties that can't be occupied tonight. Okay, so let's say that's the case. There is 9 million homes that each have a spare bedroom.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
I still in my brain though, like where do 1 million, like how do we end up with 1 million extra properties? Like what do we think they could be? Like where are they? Are they, could this be a malfunction of the negative gearing concept? So could people be having could wealthy people be having a holiday house, for instance, that they don't live in, that they're able to use the negative gearing function, which, you know, means if they've got a mortgage on it, they can claim it on tax anyway. Yeah. So is some of that the reason? Like, why do we have 1 million extra properties? Like, what are they doing? Like, how do they get there? Like, that's intriguing now that you've said it that way.
Well, especially if that statistic is right, and this has been the case for 30 years, I'm stunned, because I really thought that present sociological trends, Airbnb, present economics trends would explain that huge number of empty houses. But if we've had a disproportion of empty houses forever, 30 years is a long time. Boy, my explanations are sort of not stacking up, are they?
It's you boomers.
Pardon me, us boomers. Well, the boomers are at fault, of course. And the next thing is, of course, that we've so many, because of the leveraging and the way that you can write things off against your taxes, negative gearing. We've accumulated houses back when it was cheap to buy a house. I mean, when I first came to Australia, it was like 3 weeks before it had been $8,000 to buy a 140-acre farm, and I bought one for $18,000, and everybody said, "Oh, you got ripped off." Well, it didn't seem like it at the time. You know?
Yeah. In hindsight, by 100. Yeah.
Well, you know, you can hardly purchase them these days. So yeah, I think my thoughts are needing some revising.
I think for me that the reason that explains this consistent pattern of 10% of them being vacant for all that period of time is, for the whole time we have looked at housing as an economic mechanism.
Yeah.
So whatever the rules were 30 years ago, there were people playing those rules with their accountant and the current legislation and whatever to minimise their taxes, have a second holiday home, whatever. And the rules have changed, of course, and wages have changed against cost of living, but it is still the same economic game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So perhaps we've always aspired to have a beach hut, a shack on the beach, and maybe it truly was a humpy shack, not code compliant, and got swept away at high tide or storm event at once upon a time, and now that shack is a 3-bedroom McMansion, $3.7 million in Bondi, but it's the same economic game.
Yeah.
And you're probably right. It's probably a combination of factors. I mean, as you said, like if you had bought something that was in a regional location away from all the major suburbs 30 years ago or 40 years ago when these trends started to build. That's probably in a time when you could have bought one for less than $50,000, which now has probably been built around and is probably worth a small fortune. But I think that even goes to some of the stats where it says that the baby boomers have 54% of Australia's wealth and 56% of their wealth is tied up in property. So I bet.
Is that right?
Yeah,
56% of our wealth.
Yeah. And so if you unpack those two numbers, well, you then go, okay, well, maybe that is the case. Maybe there's a lot of second properties that were bought at that period of time where they were affordable. Now they're just sitting with no one in them, or two weeks a year they've got someone in there. But it completely changes your perspective on, the housing crisis as we know it, because there's, as you said, it's almost like capitalism has got in the way of that along the way, which is actually a good segue into our next conversation or next talking point, which is societal norms. So do you think there's a pressure for young people today to still aspire to have the great Australian dream? Like, do you think it's still front and center for a lot of people?
Well, you're the one who has kids who could be in the housing market or soon will be because they're getting through university. What are you finding? What do your kids say or their friends say?
I think, interestingly enough, I wonder whether, so my kids are 20, of course. So there is certainly, and it'd be interesting to actually dissect this, but there's actually certainly a group of their friends. And I would say, so some of my boys have got friends who are tradies that they went to school with. They're off done their apprenticeship. Some of them have jumped into quite good trades and have got through it, which means they're earning quite good money, and maybe they've already partnered up and there's two of them. So those groups or those friends of theirs have absolutely gone out and got a mortgage and started to do that. So that would say yes. But the group who haven't finished their training and the like, and those sorts of things, well, they're still considering things very differently. So my boys in particular, I don't think are that far ahead, but they still watch shows and go, oh, wow, isn't that a beautiful looking home? Look at that basketball player. He's got this McMansion thing with a pool and, 5 spots for a car. So I think societally there's still a push for people to have housing, but I think our attitudes towards housing are definitely changing. What do you think, Rowan?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably been some other norms for that age group that have significantly changed. So, of course, when I was 20, we had paper textbooks. They weren't actually carved on tablets, but they were, printed paper textbooks that you'd carry around. And now we're quite familiar with sharing resources in a subscription online way. I don't have to own this thing. We just share it around. We do that with my music. We do that with my car. I catch the bus. I catch an Uber. I get food delivered to me rather than going to it. All of these fluid ways of owning our resources are quite common.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm quite hopeful that will start to translate into alternative ways of doing it, because at 20 to be taking on a regional mortgage of a $500,000 number or a capital city $1 million number sounds absolutely catastrophic.
Terrifying.
Yeah, so
terrifying.
I wouldn't wish that on any 20-year-old, but I've obviously had the experience and opportunity to go and do all that sort of thing. So everyone else is welcome to go and have their go at it as well, I guess, is to be fair and equitable. But
I think Colby just put in the chat there, surprisingly too. Colby just commented, I think for younger people, there isn't quite the same pressure, but at the same time, life for a classic 20-year-old today is extremely different. And I think that that's sort of balancing a little bit what you said, with also that maybe society is changing a little bit. Like, so maybe there isn't quite that pressure to get into the housing market. And I wonder whether that's just because it's become so far out of reach for the bulk of people that they've almost said, whatever. And then I think there's that combination of factors which you talk to there as well, which is life for a 20-year-old today. Like, imagine even, like, could you imagine the statements you just said? Could you imagine even 15 years ago making those statements? You don't go out anywhere to get an eat. You just ring up a bloke and there's heaps of these companies that bring food to you. Everyone's got a car which you can use as basically a quasi taxi to go everywhere. The power that we have in our mobile devices. It's just unbelievable that we've seen that change in such a short period of time.
I am very, very hopeful that there will be this bridge connection between the 20-year-old demographic and the baby boomers who have the privately held real estate wealth at the moment.
Yeah.
And if we make that connection, and People Purpose Place is absolutely a platform to do that, where we de-risk it and don't hand it to government in taxes and transactional costs and end-of-life issues, and we now connect it to the youth. And maybe along the way we rub some of that wisdom and experience rubs off. That could be a quite amazing transformation for all of us. I recall having some conversations with a grandfather who'd been through the war, and I looked at him with reverence, and I clearly couldn't understand any of what he'd been through.
Yeah.
But there was a sense of elder passing on wisdom in my life. For me, and I wonder if that's something that we could tap into in this economic sense, rather than the whole try and outsmart the game that's rigged against us. If we could connect the elders to that youth demographic, and maybe within your own family, maybe wealth preservation inside family is the way to do it. The mechanism, there could be a multitude of them, but the opportunity of that is enormous.
But how do we, we're not, and you think that particular concept can happen within People Purpose Place, within the concept that you two have developed. Well, I think that's beautiful, because there is a lot of research saying that, and they've tried this in some, like Holland and Sweden, really progressive places where they install young people in aged care facilities or with old people, and the kids get a bit of break on their rent, and they spend a lot of time with the oldies. And I think that sounds healthy. But the other thing is that what that has created is a home-like atmosphere, isn't it, for the oldies? Whereas living in an aged care setting doesn't, apparently, I haven't lived in one, but apparently, I don't intend to, but apparently it just doesn't feel like home. Well, why would it? Yeah. But that's something, when you put the old together with the young, it starts to feel like home. So are we getting from the house, the structure, to the real intrinsic needs of human beings? Because it doesn't seem to me that an intrinsic need of a human being is to have 200 square meters of space to two people.
Yeah.
It just seems a little bizarre.
Yeah, you both put that beautifully. And I think that'd be something that we could hold out there as an aspirational outcome for a lot of people, is to reconnect to those two elements. And I like also what you said there, Rowan, about, probably bypassing a lot of the standard mechanisms to help that group. And I was up with Christine last week, and I remember her commenting about a young man who was there on site helping out. And she said, this is a good young man, like my sons. And, that's not easy for them to get a start, So when you have people who are good people trying to do the right thing, trying to get ahead, willing to pitch in and help out at a drop of a hat. And as you said, respectful and considerate of where they are and who they're around, what's going to give those people a leg up, and maybe what you've just painted there, Rowan, could be certainly an option. So that's very cool. So
I think it gives us that ability for community to emerge where we transfer wisdom and knowledge from our elders, and to build that in all sorts of exciting ways. If you're interested in carpentry, why wouldn't you want to listen to a master carpenter who's worked with hardwood, mortise and tenon jointing and stick building hundreds of homes in his life, saying, this is a whole new world now, but here's the skill set and here's the experience.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even when we all went up there with Dad, him just explaining to us which way to go through a thicknesser, all that stuff you wouldn't know unless you knew, right? And he just took it for granted and stood behind you and say, you got to have the curve this way and, sight the stick so it goes through the thicknesser in the right angle and the right position, whereas you could do that wrong for a very long time. Tapping into that, 60 years of knowledge specifically in there. So I think that maybe
easy at his experience, but it's beautiful to see it transferred.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Especially when young people are open to, a real exchange, which I think, Darren, happened last week when you were here.
I agree. Yep.
Nobody pulled any ego trips on anybody else. Ideas came out and flowed. Each idea was discussed on its own merits. We kept throwing things around and we came up with a good solution.
Oh, absolutely.
Or a couple of good solutions.
Yeah. I mean, Rodney came up with a cracker there in regards to why don't we just put it here? Well, why don't we? Because it just seems like the best location. Why are we wandering over there? And that's so everyone has a unique perspective which has real value. That makes a lot of sense.
But I've lost track of that question. There was another question asked that Colby threw up on the bottom of the screen for us, and I've lost track of what that was. I've forgotten what it was, but we didn't really answer it.
I think Colby, he said that.
Yeah.
I think he had said here that I think for younger people there isn't quite the same pressure, but at the same time, life for a 20-year-old today is extremely different. So I think very good points, and it was good for him to be able to add in perspective to the conversation, because obviously, we can look at it with our eyes, but it's good to hear that from someone else who's actually in that, which, as you said, Rowan, gives us some hope. And I think also the next term we were going to talk to was, has capitalism changed the way we view housing and almost separated it from the term homing?
Well, it's almost inevitable, isn't it? The economic structure that you live in is determinative of an awful lot of things. And I mean, all this individualism is part of capitalism, isn't it? That I'm the one who has to look out for myself, and I have to fight for myself, and I get what I made. And it's never about what's the best for everybody.
I agree that the capitalism singly and on its own as a pure focus takes away the whole concept of home and just looks at these structures as widgets to build your economic wealth. But I think we still have a basic understanding that a 5-kilogram steak for lunch is excessive. You can't eat
it.
And
I share it. I reckon.
I'll have it back. No, it won't go in. But most of us would have some sort of stop mechanism that says the chef's cooking you a 5-kilo steak and you're going, hang on.
Wait.
That's a little bit too much.
Give me a doggy bag.
People, we could serve some more tomorrow. Maybe we could feed more people with that. So I think we would have, I think there are, most people would have some sort of rationale about that. I'm certain we don't see the same equivalence in our homes at 300 and 400 and 800 square meters.
No.
There's a website that I love going to every now and then just to completely lose my mind. Doesn't do anything under 10,000 square feet.
Really?
Of course you don't. Why would you?
10,000.
It's
And then people
how
jumping in the
big is
window.
that?
the loneliest, most miserable people on the planet buy those homes because they can't
Yes.
find anyone else. Like in
That's
10,000
right.
square
They
feet,
get lost.
where is anyone?
Maybe they're really stinky and they don't want their smell to pass on to anyone else. I don't know what it is.
Whatever it is. So,
So-
we could do that.
But is your point that capitalism by itself is maybe not the problem? It's those pesky humans who have applied it in
Yeah.
all sorts of ridiculous ways.
If you apply it in all situations, all times for everything, then I think, beer occasionally I've heard is good for you. So, all things, all time, every meal is probably not.
Yeah.
And capitalism is much the same, or religion, or perhaps anything. If you take it as that's the go-to answer for every situation, then maybe we're going to end up in trouble. It's an easy game to play, though. So it's easy for a politician to sell economics. The media love economics. It's just the easiest go-to mechanism. You've got fun tickets each week. You can buy so many of these things. Let's all play the game of economics. If we delve into it in any level of scrutiny, you get 20 economists in a room and you get 20 different opinions. Like, it's not absolute.
No, absolutely not. Far from it.
I think it almost goes to
fact, the economists at this point don't really know how to advise us because we've walked into sort of backed into a situation that is so complex and so unusual in the world of everything. I mean, it isn't just social media that changed in the last 20 years or iPhones or anything like that. The entire society has started to evolve in ways that aren't always 100% healthy. And capitalism is part of that.
Yeah.
And
the overstress on economic values.
Yes.
And it's so corrupted and diluted, and there's these deals within deals that we look at an international trade situation, we rail against, they get a subsidy for this and how can we compete with that, and we get a tariff here. It's exactly the same situation buying local fish and chips or anything in your own neighborhood. There are so many distortions and corruptions that there's no true open, free and fair market.
No.
It doesn't exist.
And it's almost like this, the comment that had been made before about this whole, perpetuating a loop of you need to go and earn more money so you can pay a higher rent. It's almost like a self-perpetuating circle, and I think when you have that realization, it actually is a bit scary to think, okay, so we're working, then we need to work more so then we can afford more, so we can spend more just to survive. Like we come back to the start again with just the basics. And one of the gentlemen I was having a conversation with today said, he was talking about particularly the situation of, and this may be right or wrong, but the philosophy of what he was saying was the feminist revolution gave the ability for two people to work in the house, right? So then everything increased in price as a part of that. So because you have two people employed, then homes become more and more expensive. Then we got into this loop then that both people had to work to afford a home. And then we started to come back and have a look at going, well, why did we become a couple in the first place? The idea is to give ourselves more time and to be able to enjoy ourselves. And we've almost come in this full circle where if you actually wanted to have one of you stay at home, almost impossible now to do that. Like the cycle has been so much broken that ultimately to get back to that starting point is almost physically impossible. So yes, very interesting. And I think got probably two topics to have a yak to finish off with. And one of the conversations is about, we have all heard the term social housing, but what does that mean versus a social?
You just glitched out a bit, Darren. Could you repeat that?
So the two terms that are similar to each other but very different is, we've all heard the term social housing, but how does that compare to a social home?
Yeah, it's for mind, and in light of this conversation, Christine might have just dropped off, or her camera's gone. The social housing sounds like, feels like, and looking at the media, very much the economic story about, we've produced so many widgets, we need so many widgets, we've got this $1 billion to do widgets. And that's wonderful, great game, let's all play that. But has it actually addressed a home for anyone? Like, not only the 50,000 people on the wait list, or the 1,200 homes you're going to build, or the $4 billion, or whatever it is that your headline, has it produced a home for anyone? And we're not
that
even...
feels really satisfying and really expands their own sense of themselves. I don't know.
Don't get me wrong, I think there's absolutely a place and a need for governments to say, for those of us in society who cannot meet basic agreements, we can't pay rent on a weekly basis, or we have medical issues right now that we can't contribute, or we can't maintain a regular household in a normal agreement way, then maybe social housing is exactly what we need for people who have ability issues, or regular finance issues, all those sort of things. But I think all of us would also hope that, where possible, these are temporary conditions, that people pass through an addiction period and then come out the other side, or we learn to adapt to a disability and we now re-enter the workforce, rather than forever being institutionalized into that pigeonhole, never to move again.
I think that can happen, can't it? That you can't leave your social housing because you'll never get back in the queue, for example.
Absolutely.
I mean, fortunately, I've never had that situation, but I think it happens. And how do we, when we, when even rich people who are spending $4 million on a house aren't living a really satisfying, evolving, expanding life in their fabulous castles, what hope do the people who can't scrape the money together have?
Just getting by,
because all they're doing is getting, I mean, if the hyper rich are just getting by and having horrible lives, and the question is, what is it that makes a good society? And that's what makes, the thinking along those lines is what makes a good home, or a real home. A house is easy compared to a home. And I think that's your point, Rowan, isn't it? Oh, lost Darren. I disappeared for a minute, and now Darren's disappeared.
It's the rolling dropouts, because we're onto something here. Right. The Matrix is trying to keep it strum.
Yeah, maybe we're getting a hint that it's time to stop. Shut up, you two.
But I do wonder if if it's its purest, most helpful form of thinking about the housing topic, if in our own individual mind we can get past the economic barrier and just think about what it is that I need for a home. What is a home for me, and how do I create those relationships within that home? And often they're really personal, relationship with kids, the dog, grandparents, whatever it is. Unrelated people, the Brady Bunch and all these versions thereafter have massively escalated. So we try and find amenable relations within this space. If we focused on that primarily and economically as a secondary thing, I think we would be far, far better off and open to many more opportunities. What do you think?
I absolutely agree, but I feel this struggle within myself at times as well. That what really deeply makes sense isn't what I necessarily do.
Oh, and